Hello, hello. It's a cloudy October day. We're still here in the car. Not too cold, but typical October day. Nothing particularly out of the ordinary. It's quite overcast. It looks like it's gonna rain, but it hasn't yet. Today, in discussion, what we're going to be discussing, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Now, I got this from one of those great things that are called libraries. Highly recommend those. Now, Virginia Woolf was an English author in the early 20th century. She was born in the late 1890s, and she died in 1941. She's very influential in the Modernist tradition, and this book was published in 1927. And in many ways, people believe that it was a bit of a reaction towards James Joyce's Ulysses, which was a modernist epic and still remains a modernist epic that was lauded at the time, and even to this day it remains one of the defining pieces of modernism. However, To the Lighthouse also manages to make its way into the great collection of modernist texts. And the reason it's a bit of a reaction to Ulysses, it seems, is it's clear that Virginia Woolf did read Ulysses. This is well known. I think her letters express this. And while she liked many parts of Ulysses, she felt it to be a bit too inaccessible for all. And I've yet to read Ulysses, but she felt it to include perhaps too many scholarly and literary references. I know Ulysses is rife with those. And it seemed, I believe she said something to the effect that there's no doubt Joyce is a great artist, a great writer, but perhaps he was posturing too much, something to the effect of that. Now, To the Lighthouse, although it's only about 250 pages long, it can be a bit of a difficult read for those who are not familiar with the writing style and the stream of conscious style that Virginia Woolf is employing. And I have read other stream of conscious writers, Faulkner in particular, who is a bit hit or miss for me. Conrad sometimes employs a bit of that. But this is very much a stream of consciousness from the get-go. It doesn't relent. And you aren't really given much time to anchor yourself. Really, you're not given any time to anchor yourself within this story. It kind of throws you right within the story. And this is the type of book, I believe, that you could kind of open up anywhere and it wouldn't really matter that much. Obviously, you would miss many things, but the main reason people read these books is really the style in many ways. The themes are quite important. There are many themes that are buried beneath this text, but the style of her writing is what really captivates the audience. Now, the style of stream of consciousness, it differs for every writer that employs it. But with Virginia Woolf, she engages with a both panoramic and microscopic view in her writing. So the narrator's omniscient, but sometimes it'll seem like the narrator embeds itself really within a character, and you start to understand the character by an incredibly abstract sense. This text is rife with metaphors. Many of them kind of pass me by. I'm not really quite sure what to grasp from them. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that this book is almost 100 years old, and I miss a lot of them. But there are some that really stick and are quite well done and quite interesting. She has a whole collection of characters that she kind of zooms into, and then she'll zoom out to the whole scene and how the characters relate to each other. And sometimes it's really hard to anchor yourself in this story because it'll be very quick. She won't really give you much to grasp on right away. Many of these turns, as far as perspective, happen quite quickly within the same paragraph. So the style can be quite difficult. I found it myself a bit difficult at first. However, there are anchoring points within this text, I feel. I feel like one of the anchoring points for myself in particular, as odd as it may sound, was the character of Tansley. Now, Tansley is a character who is he's essentially... Before I actually talk about the characters, what is this book really about? It's kind of hard to... it's basic in a sense, but there's not much of a plot within this story. To the Lighthouse, I thought it was going to be much more of a quest-driven narrative, similar to Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, sort of this family, this group of people making a pilgrimage to the lighthouse. And that's not incorrect. That is, in a sense, what this is about, the gist of the plot, but it's not as... it's definitely not as plot-oriented in regards to that. It rather deals with style and themes. So what it's about is this family, this British family, that is pretty well off. The patriarch, the father, is Mr. Ramsay. He is a professor, a pretty notable professor, but not completely groundbreaking, but definitely a respected professor. And his wife, the matriarch, Mrs. Ramsay, who she seems to be the ideal wife. She's attentive to her family's needs, it seems, attentive to her husband's needs, Mr. Ramsay, who is a bit of an odd character. He's a bit of, in some sense, a bit of a megalomaniac, a bit idiosyncratic, a bit my way or the highway. And in some ways, he's described as tyrannical by other characters. The characters that describe him as tyrannical are actually his children, a few of his children. In particular, James, who is probably the main child character in this. And James really wants to go to the lighthouse, and this is expressed in the first page. He really wants to go. However, the weather is not good enough, and Mr. Ramsay says the weather will not be good enough tomorrow to go to the lighthouse. And this patriarchal figure of Mr. Ramsay as the father, who sort of seems to dictate to the young James what the weather's going to be like and that they can't go, this has a sort of a binding effect, it seems, that causes James to develop, in some ways, like a bit of an, maybe to insert Freud and say Oedipal complex is probably a bit too much, but he definitely develops some resentment towards his father. And you can tell that this resentment was brewing even prior to this, to how the narrative was set up. You can tell even prior to the narrative that James took issue with his father. And this is little James, who is, I believe he's like 8 years old, 9 years old, something like that. So he takes umbrage with his father being able to sort of know that, oh, the weather's not going to be good, we're not going tomorrow. And Mr. Ramsay kind of basks in this power to be able to say, no, we're not going to go. And I know that because I know how the weather's going to be like. Being able to predict the weather and all of that. So those are three very important characters. There's a whole cast of other characters as well. There are other children, James's brothers, the other Ramsays, Andrew, Cam, I forgot their names. Now, the children are not the most fleshed out characters, which makes sense. They haven't lived enough in life to be too fleshed out. But definitely James is one of the most fleshed out ones, and he comes back later in the story much to play a bit of a role. So James really wants to go to the lighthouse, but they're not able to, and that creates a psychic distress with him. And then there are other characters, such as Lily Briscoe, who's a very important character, and she's a young woman who's a painter as well. She loves to paint. However, many people around her, especially Mrs. Ramsay, see her as a woman who ought to get married soon. This creates a tension between Lily and her vocation, her passion of painting, and other people around her who struggle, many of them, to see her as a painter. Because at that time, very few women were afforded the ability to paint, to be painters. And even less were afforded the ability to be painters and to live a normal life and to be married was the expectation of women at that time. Now, Woolf came from a family of feminists. Second wave? I don't know. I'm not as familiar with the feminists, but the early 20th century feminists, very early ones. She came from a pretty well-to-do family. They were a bit eccentric, and she kind of carried a few of those traits. She was a part of a group, a writing group called the Bloomsbury Group. Yeah, the Bloomsbury Group. Yeah, the Bloomsbury Group, I believe. And they were a bit bohemian, a bit counter the norms. They countered, they were much more bohemian, much more against convention to the early 20th century British society, as it related to sexuality in particular. So her husband, it's pretty well known that her and her husband, while they did like each other, they each had their own romantic affairs, and that didn't seem to bother each other too much. A little bit like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Now, as I said, oddly a character that is quite anchoring within this narrative is the character of Tansley, Charles Tansley, who's a young student who wants to make a name for himself in the profession as a academic, and he's following Mr. Ramsay. This whole story pretty much takes place on their vacation house in the Hebrides, which is it's a region of Scotland. It's a region with a lot of, stormy weather, I presume, crags and jagged rocks and all of that you can get that image out of from that place, in a sense. And that's where it's taking place. They're at their vacation house there. And Charles Tansley follows Mr. Ramsay there because he wants to be an academic. And this Charles Tansley character is one of the most... He's an easily despicable character. Virginia Woolf makes a very clear impression with him, a first impression with him, that he's this conflicted academic character, but also this very dislikable character at first, and you start to see he's a little bit more nuanced later on. But the fact that we have this character that is very clearly despicable and disliked by everyone else, and you can tell that everyone else dislikes him, that's very much an anchoring. That was an anchoring point for me, and that happens very early on within a few pages of the novel, and I felt much more anchored by that. There are other characters, such as a poet called Carmichael. He isn't too significant, although he's a struggling poet at first, and after the time skip, and there's a time skip that happens, he becomes much more well-renowned. So obviously there's always going to be spoilers in these reviews or these discussions. These are not reviews. But the novel is set up in 3 parts. The first part takes up the bulk, and it is during the before 1910, I think, early 1900s. And then the second part documents essentially, I think 15 years or 10, 15 years, maybe close to 20 years after that, in the wake of World War I. So the second part is a very quick part. It's called Time Passes. It's a part in which Virginia Woolf distills about, I can't remember exactly how long this time frame is, but between 10 and 20 years, she distills that in about 20 pages. She writes about how the seasons change, and it's quite a beautiful section of the book. The seasons change, the house is empty, and you really get the perspective of the house, in a sense, which appears many times over and over, the perspective of the house as kind of being observant of all these characters. And during the flash forward, we come to know that Mrs. Ramsay has died. Two or three of their kids, I can't remember, 2 or 3 of their kids have died as well. One in World War I, and in the third part they come back to the house. They're only ever really it's only ever described when they're in the Hebrides. You don't learn about their lives in London or elsewhere in England. So the third part they come back, they're all much older. Lily Briscoe is still doing her thing, being a painter. She's still not married. And they continue with their quest of going to the lighthouse. And it's clear that they are going to go to the lighthouse this time because their father, Mr. Ramsay, is quite adamant of going there. And they do end up reaching the lighthouse. It's nothing spectacular. You don't even get to really see what's inside the lighthouse at all. The narrative pretty much ends when Mr. Ramsay steps on a rock to enter into the lighthouse. So, as far as its themes, the passing of time is a very important theme within here. There can be sections of this book, as I mentioned, that get years that could be distilled within just a few pages. But there could also be minutes that seem to last tens of pages within this narrative. Minutes that in which Virginia Woolf hones in on a thought particular, and she creates this effect of almost slowing down time and speeding up time. It's really quite remarkable in many instances of the novel. She has one of the greatest dinner party scenes, I believe. Definitely one of the greatest dinner party scenes I have read. And that's the climax of the first part of the book. It happens lasts around 30 pages. It happens at the end of the first part. And it's an amazing dinner party scene in which multiple conversations are happening, and then something will happen. In one conversation, someone will feel slighted, a bit annoyed, and it'll return. That thing will return 5-10 pages later, and that character will be mulling what they said, thinking about how to sort of reassert themselves and their identity as well. Class is also an interesting issue here. It appears every once in a while. In the sense that, very much particular in Charles Tansley's character, he wants to become a an academic, as I mentioned. However, he comes from a working class background, and he tries his best to shun that and to not let that come out. But he's at odds with, it's very difficult for him to talk to people on a very non-academic, colloquial manner when he's trying so hard to show this facade of being an academic. He's also very sexist and believes that women should not be doing art, and he's very much an antagonist to Lily Briscoe, a psychic antagonist. But time as a theme is incredibly important. And to continue on to that, there is also a tension of being aware of mortality, that we are not going to last, but not just mortality, that our legacies don't even endure. Our legacies will be forgotten. There's a famous line, and this theme, this metaphor comes up. It's not really a metaphor, but it's a statement. It comes up a few more times. And the line is that this stone, and Mr. Ramsay is thinking about this because his psychic struggle is whether his work as an academic will last, whether he has made an impact onto the field. And he's coming to terms with the fact that his legacy will fade in some way. It'll kind of blend and fade maybe with the next zeitgeist. But his name and his work, the actual concrete elements of his philosophy, they're going to be lost at some point. The line in which Mr. Ramsay is pondering his significance is that this stone that he is observing will actually outlast Shakespeare, the greatest writer in the English language. This stone will outlast Shakespeare. So the sense of the fleetingness of time, the ephemeral nature of time, props up over and over again throughout this narrative. And interestingly enough, it is Mr. Ramsay, during the voyage to the lighthouse, voyage is a bit too much, a little trip to the lighthouse, that stares in awe at the lighthouse there. Even though James and Cam, who wanted to go quite badly, especially James, they start to look at the lighthouse as just a lighthouse, not something incredibly mythical. They don't see an incredible significance in the lighthouse. However, Mr. Ramsay is staring in awe at the lighthouse, and he's probably pondering his mortality and the fact that he couldn't see this lighthouse one more time with his wife. Meanwhile, James and Cam are staring at their father, and they still have a sense of animosity towards him that's building. And it's here that they describe him as a tyrant, and they want to do everything against tyranny. Now, whether Mr. Ramsay is really an antagonist, I don't believe so, because when he said that the weather was bad, it really was bad. They probably couldn't go. But the fact that he was gloating a bit and quite confident in it, and he didn't take compassion in the earlier stories, perhaps that just shows a flaw in his character. And his character definitely has many flaws. And, yeah. Overall, there are many portions of the story that are a bit difficult. They don't really stick to me, but there are some portions that are incredibly beautiful. It's not an easy read, but I highly recommend it to someone who's interested in the style, interested in very much poetic language, and definitely someone who has a knack for looking for deeper themes within the narrative. There's not much plot, barely any plot, but otherwise it's a very good book, I believe. And the characters are quite interesting, quite well fleshed out, and you get like such an interesting, as I mentioned, panoramic and then microscopic view of the characters. So yeah, that's Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.